4 years ago, 23-year-old university student Emily Johnson vanished from her small rented home on the outskirts of Missoula while recovering from COVID-19. She told friends she felt feverish but safe. Then, sometime between a late-night text and dawn, she simply ceased to exist. Her disappearance plunged her parents, Claire and Robert, into a fog of grief and left the entire neighborhood asking how a bright young woman could slip through the cracks of her own life without making a sound. Antes de seguir, inscreva-se e ative o sininho. Aqui a gente reabre casos arquivados com respeito e prova. The first officers on scene found Emily's laptop still streaming a lecture on indigenous cultural preservation, her unfinished anthropology thesis glowing on the screen. A kettle sat cooling on the stove, steam long since dissipated, and her phone rested on the nightstand displaying 17 missed calls from her worried roommate who lived across town. The house felt suspended in time. Her coffee mug still held lukewarm liquid, textbooks lay open to pages about ritualistic burial practices, and her glasses case sat empty on the desk where she always placed it before bed. Because Emily had recently tested positive for the virus, the house felt doubly haunted by illness and by whatever unseen force had lifted her from her bed. Detectives wore full protective gear, their voices muffled behind N95 masks as they processed a scene that felt more like a museum exhibit than a crime. The lead investigator, Detective Sarah Martinez, noted the eerie preservation of normalcy. No signs of struggle, no broken windows, no evidence of forced entry. It was as if Emily had simply evaporated into the Montana spring air. Day after day, Emily's family organized masked search parties that fanned out along the Clark Fork River, calling her name into the wind that carried pine scent and lingering winter chill. Volunteers taped missing person flyers to shuttered storefronts, but foot traffic was thin. Montana's lockdown dimmed both streets and hope. The yellow flyers fluttered like butterflies against boarded windows, Emily's senior portrait smiling from beneath protective plastic sheeting. Claire Johnson, Emily's mother, walked the same routes daily, distributing flyers to essential workers, grocery clerks, and mail carriers. She carried a folder thick with Emily's photos, baby pictures, high school graduation, college acceptance letter, the last selfie taken 3 days before the disappearance. Each conversation became a small memorial, a way of keeping Emily present in a world that seemed eager to forget. The Johnsons clung to each rumor with desperate hope. A girl seen boarding a Greyhound bus in Billings, a patient matching Emily's description admitted to a Boise clinic, a cashier in Helena who swore she'd seen those distinctive gold-rimmed glasses. They drove hundreds of miles chasing phantom sightings, only to watch every lead disintegrate under scrutiny. Each false alarm carved deeper trenches in their hearts. Robert, an insurance adjuster accustomed to evaluating damage, found himself unable to quantify this particular loss. He began obsessively documenting everything: phone records, witness statements, police reports, constructing a paper trail that might lead to his daughter. His home office transformed into a war room, walls covered with timelines and photographs connected by red string like a detective thriller. As weeks bled into months, the official task force quietly downsized. Budget constraints, new COVID outbreaks overwhelming the hospital system, and a backlog of domestic violence cases relegated Emily's file to a dusty shelf in the records annex. The initial team of 12 investigators dwindled to 3, then one part-time detective juggling 17 cold cases. Press conferences became monthly, then quarterly, then stopped altogether. Her parents, refusing to let time bleach their daughter's face from public memory, began live-stream vigils every Sunday evening. They sat in their living room, candles flickering against Montana twilight streaming through windows, speaking to a camera about memories and hope. Claire would hold Emily's favorite stuffed elephant, a childhood companion named Peanut, while Robert read excerpts from her letters home describing university life, new friends, academic discoveries. Those digital flames drew a steady trickle of viewers, but no concrete answers. Comment sections filled with sympathy, amateur theories, and occasional cruelty from internet trolls. The Johnsons learned to moderate carefully, preserving space for genuine support while filtering out noise. Some viewers became regular participants, creating an unlikely community bound by shared concern for a stranger's missing daughter. By spring 2022, the case felt frozen in amber, preserved but lifeless. Reporters stopped calling. Classmates moved on to internships and summer jobs. The Johnsons' marriage strained under the weight of unspoken blame and sleepless nights. Conversations became minefields. Should they sell Emily's car, donate her clothes, acknowledge the growing possibility that she might never return home? Yet Claire kept Emily's room untouched, the desk cluttered with anthropology textbooks and highlighted passages about cultural memory. The closet still scented faintly of lavender detergent and the vanilla body spray Emily wore to campus parties. Post-it notes decorated her mirror with reminders about assignment due dates and social plans that would never be kept. For Claire, memory was an act of rebellion against the bureaucratic convenience of forgetting. Emily's younger brother Sam, then 16, channeled his grief into art, creating charcoal portraits of his sister that grew more abstract with time. Initially, realistic renderings gave way to impressionistic shadows, faces dissolving into landscapes, figures walking toward horizons that bled off the paper's edge. His art teacher encouraged submissions to student exhibitions, but Sam refused, calling them too private for strangers' walls. Some houses never stop echoing the last footsteps taken within them, and the Johnson home vibrated with Emily's absence. The first anniversary of Emily's disappearance arrived with late April snow, fat flakes that clung to budding trees like a seasonally confused farewell. In the basement of St. Andrew's Community Centre, socially distanced folding chairs faced a projector, repeating the same montage of childhood photos. Emily in a treehouse she'd built with her father, at junior prom in a borrowed turquoise dress, crossing the University of Montana campus in the bright red cowboy boots that became her signature. Each image collided with the present tense that no longer held her. The empty chair at Christmas dinner, the unused bedroom upstairs, the graduation ceremony she would miss in 3 weeks. The slideshow played on repeat, a digital prayer wheel of memory and longing. Robert Johnson opened the vigil with a tremor in his voice that hadn't been there the year before. "Do we still believe Emily will come home?" he said. But the thinning crowd, mostly family friends, a few curious reporters, and volunteers from the initial search efforts, revealed how belief erodes when mystery hardens into routine. The pandemic had changed social rituals. People sat farther apart, spoke more quietly, left earlier. Afterward, Detective Carlos Ramirez, newly assigned to the department's COVID Files unit, a bureaucratic euphemism for cases complicated by pandemic protocols, assured the Johnsons that fresh eyes could help crack the investigation. Privately, he admitted to colleagues that the department was drowning in backlogged cases, funding shifted to narcotics operations and cybercrime, leaving cold cases to rot in understaffed units. Ramirez inherited 17 unsolved disappearances, 3 suspicious deaths, and a dozen domestic violence cases that had gone cold during lockdown chaos. Emily's file sat fourth in a stack prioritized by probability of resolution, a cruel calculus that reduced human anguish to statistical likelihood. He promised weekly updates, but managed monthly emails filled with phrases like ongoing investigation and pursuing all leads. Meanwhile, Emily's best friend, Rachel Nguyen, chased her own leads with the obsessive dedication of someone who refused to accept institutional failure. She sifted through Discord chats, looking for unusual conversations, analyzed Venmo logs for suspicious transactions, and geotagged selfies searching for patterns in Emily's final weeks. Rachel had switched her college major from business to criminal justice, driven by a growing certainty that Emily's case required citizen advocacy. One unsettling discovery emerged from this digital archaeology. Gordon Blake, the neighbor whose property bordered Emily's backyard, had messaged Emily twice in her final week. The first message offered to pick up groceries during your quarantine, and the second asked if she needed any help around the house while you're stuck inside. Police had noted the exchanges during initial questioning, but dismissed Blake's outreach as neighborly concern typical of small-town Montana culture. Rachel felt the dismissal rang of convenience rather than thorough investigation. She researched Blake's background, finding a 37-year-old bachelor who worked remotely for an accounting firm, had no social media presence, and had moved to the neighborhood just 18 months before Emily's disappearance. Previous neighbors described him as quiet and private, but none could recall conversations lasting more than a few sentences. Tensions simmered when Claire requested an independent forensic sweep of Emily's rental house. The department denied her petition, citing ongoing health risk protocols and budget constraints. The house had been cleaned and re-rented 6 months after Emily's disappearance, destroying potential evidence that might have emerged with better technology or delayed processing. Furious at bureaucratic stonewalling, Claire filed a complaint under the fictitious Community Transparency Act, compelling police to release non-sensitive documents from Emily's investigation. The cache revealed troubling gaps: evidence bags with smudged labels, missing security camera footage from the convenience store at the neighborhood's entrance, and a 4-hour window, between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. on April 17th, where digital surveillance simply went dark. Each omission widened the gulf between official narrative and lived reality. The police report described a thorough canvass of the neighborhood, but interviews revealed that Blake's house had been skipped during initial door-to-door questioning because no one answered his repeated knocks. A follow-up visit occurred 3 days later, by which time Blake claimed he'd been visiting his sister in Kalispell and couldn't assist with the timeline. Rachel turned to online forums dedicated to the Montana vanishings, posting detailed timelines and theories under the handle or Echo Ridge. The thread attracted amateur sleuths who pored over satellite maps, analyzed public records, and crowdsourced investigative theories. A retired cartographer from Oregon noticed a blackout zone in the city's fiber optic network coinciding with Emily's disappearance, but the finding was brushed aside as unrelated technical noise. The online community grew passionate but fragmented. Some members suspected human trafficking rings. Others theorized about pandemic-related mental health crises leading to voluntary disappearance. A few focused obsessively on Blake, analyzing his property records and employment history. Rachel tried to moderate discussions toward productive leads while avoiding harassment of potential suspects who might be innocent. Crowdsourcing investigation, while passionate and sometimes insightful, was beginning to look like a labyrinth of hopeful but dead-end corridors. Every promising theory demanded field investigation that amateur sleuths couldn't legally pursue. Rachel realized that citizen advocacy required professional partnership, not replacement, but the police seemed resistant to collaboration they couldn't control. Sometimes a circle drawn in chalk becomes a wall of silence that protects no one and serves nothing. By mid-2023, Missoula bustled again with pre-pandemic energy. Restaurants reopened patios that had been closed for seasons. Students flooded dormitories after 2 years of remote learning, and the community college resumed in-person classes. Mask mandates lifted like morning fog, revealing faces that had been hidden behind protective barriers for years. The pandemic felt like a half-remembered nightmare, something people preferred to discuss in past tense. Yet for the Johnsons, every reopened storefront was a reminder that Emily hadn't walked through those doors to rejoin the world. While neighbors celebrated returning normalcy, Claire found herself increasingly isolated by grief that refused to follow the community's collective timeline of healing. She returned to teaching part-time at the elementary school, but spent evenings reviewing case files, illuminated by a single desk lamp. Her kitchen table transformed into a command center of hope and frustration. Sleep became a visitor she rarely entertained. Her nights filled with internet searches for similar cases, true crime podcasts that might offer insights, and forensic science articles that taught her to speak the language of investigation. Robert worried about his wife's obsession, but couldn't offer alternatives that felt more constructive than despair. Their house grew quiet as conversation topics narrowed to Emily's case or careful avoidance of Emily's case. The local press, hungry for fresh headlines in a news cycle that had moved beyond pandemic coverage, pivoted to economic recovery stories and tourism revival. Editors claimed readers needed optimism, not depressing cold cases that dragged down community morale. Emily's image came down from the television station's website homepage. The algorithm favored trending hashtags over lingering sorrows that generated fewer clicks than restaurant openings and hiking trail reports. Stripped of media coverage, the Johnsons started mailing handwritten appeals to senators, charitable organizations, and producers of national crime shows. Claire's letters grew more sophisticated with practice, incorporating statistics about missing person cases, details about investigative failures, and emotional appeals that tried to make Emily's humanity visible to strangers. Most responses came in the form of polite regrets or silence, though several advocacy groups offered resources for families navigating similar situations. When Rachel tried to organize a second anniversary march, only 24 people showed up on a rainy Thursday evening in April. Among them was Emily's younger brother, Sam, now 17, and channeling quiet anger into increasingly bold public art. His grief had evolved from charcoal portraits to guerrilla installations. Stylized wheat-pasted posters reading, "Where is Emily?" appeared on construction barriers, abandoned buildings, and overpasses throughout Missoula. The posters featured Emily's face rendered in stark black and white, her distinctive glasses serving as a symbol that passers-by began to recognize. Sam's art teacher praised his technical skill, but worried about the legal implications of unsanctioned public installation. When Sam was arrested for vandalism after police connected his work to surveillance footage, the incident further soured relations between the Johnson family and local law enforcement. Public sympathy, once abundant during the initial search efforts, began to fray under the weight of conflicting narratives about police competence, family obsession, and community responsibility. Some neighbors expressed frustration with the ongoing attention, feeling that the Johnson family's grief had become an uncomfortable reminder of unresolved tragedy in their otherwise healing community. Inside the police department, the cold case board had turned into a collage of faded photographs and yellowing notes that no one looked at anymore. A junior analyst discovered an untested KN95 mask collected from Emily's driveway during the initial investigation, but DNA analysis revealed only household members' genetic material plus environmental contamination. The oversight underscored a larger truth. Evidence without context is a locked door without a key. Detective Ramirez, overwhelmed by caseload and understaffed department politics, found himself rotating between active investigations with more promising leads. He genuinely cared about Emily's disappearance, but faced administrative pressure to focus resources on cases with higher clearance potential. Bureaucratic efficiency demanded triage decisions that felt inhumane to families stuck in limbo. As autumn leaves rustled across empty bleachers at Washington Grizzly Stadium, Claire stood alone during halftime of a football game Emily should have attended as a senior. She could almost see her daughter in the student section, cheering with friends who had graduated and moved on to careers in other cities. The ghost of Emily's missed future haunted every milestone and gathering. Claire whispered, "I'm still here," a promise and a plea, hoping the wind would carry the words to whichever horizon held Emily's fate. The stadium lights illuminated thousands of faces, none of them her daughter's, but each one a reminder that life continued its relentless forward motion, even when some hearts remained frozen. In April 2021. Memory can taste like ash when no one else is still eating the smoke, and the Johnsons found themselves choking on grief while their community breathed freely again. June 2023 brought a record-breaking heat wave that cracked sidewalks and pushed Montana's electrical grid to capacity limits. Construction crews worked dawn shifts to avoid afternoon temperatures that climbed toward 105 degrees. On Evergreen Drive, contractors gutted Gordon Blake's detached garage to install updated wiring for electric vehicle charging stations, a home improvement project financed by federal tax credits and rising property values in the gentrifying neighborhood. When crews pulled down a warped plywood shelf that had been installed by previous owners, a small velvet-lined jewelry case tumbled onto the concrete floor with a sound like castanets. Inside, nestled in faded purple silk, were prescription eyeglasses with distinctive gold frames that the lead foreman immediately recognized from missing person posters that had once papered every bulletin board in town. The distinctive frames were Emily Johnson's signature accessory, worn in every photograph her family had distributed during 2 years of desperate searching. The glasses prescription matched optometry records that police had collected during the initial investigation, and tiny initials, EMJ, for Emily Marie Johnson, were engraved inside the left temple arm. The foreman, a 30-year construction veteran named Mike Torino, froze when he made the connection. He ordered his crew to stop work immediately and called 911 from the garage doorway, not wanting to contaminate what might be crucial evidence. Within 20 minutes, police tape cordoned off the entire property while detectives suited up in protective gear to process the scene. Police sealed Blake's garage as a potential crime scene, but rumors leaked within hours through a network of police scanners, construction workers, and neighborhood social media groups. The Nextdoor app exploded with speculation. Had Blake been hiding evidence all along? Were the glasses planted to frame an innocent man? Was this the breakthrough the Johnson family had been praying for, or another cruel, false hope? When Detective Ramirez questioned Blake at the police station, the accountant claimed complete ignorance about the glasses' presence in his garage. He insisted the warped shelf had been installed by previous homeowners and that he rarely used the garage for anything other than storing lawn equipment and seasonal decorations. Blake provided receipts showing he'd purchased the property in late 2019, nearly 18 months before Emily's disappearance, and claimed he'd never bothered to thoroughly clean out spaces left by former residents. The discovery cracked open fault lines that had been building for 2 years. Claire felt vindicated by the find, seeing it as proof that police had failed to properly investigate obvious leads. Robert feared another dead end that would destroy their family's emotional equilibrium twice over. Rachel blasted the police department on social media for initially ignoring Blake's messages to Emily and their failure to search his property during the original investigation. Comment sections on local news articles polarized along predictable lines. Half the town demanded Blake's immediate arrest, while the other half cautioned against mob justice and rushed to judgment. Discussions grew heated at coffee shops and grocery stores, dividing friends and neighbors who had previously united in sympathy for the Johnson family's loss. Amid the community noise, Sam spray-painted a new mural on the underpass near campus, a pair of floating glasses over the words, "She sees us still." The artwork went viral on TikTok, shared by true crime enthusiasts and missing person advocacy groups across the country. For the first time in months, Emily's case attracted national attention, but the spotlight felt both hopeful and intrusive to her exhausted family. Forensic technicians lifted latent fingerprints from the glasses frames using advanced techniques that hadn't been available during the pandemic supply shortages of 2021. They found partials consistent with Emily's prints from DMV records, plus a second set, too degraded by time and heat to produce definitive matches in criminal databases. The presence of multiple prints suggested the glasses had been handled by someone other than Emily, though innocent explanations remained plausible. Soil analysis of particles trapped in the glass's hinges revealed sediment consistent with the Clark Fork River floodplain, approximately 8 miles southeast of Blake's property, fueling speculation that the glasses had been moved from the location where Emily disappeared. However, the soil samples also contained common minerals found throughout western Montana, making geographic pinpointing impossible without additional evidence. Despite the leads pointing in Blake's direction, the police department hesitated to classify him as an official suspect, citing insufficient probable cause for arrest. The cautious approach sparked renewed accusations of institutional cowardice from the Johnson family and their growing circle of supporters, who organized protests demanding more aggressive investigation of the neighbor who had been overlooked for 2 years. Local journalists revived Emily's story with renewed intensity, but their coverage often stiffened into sensationalism that prioritized drama over facts. Headlines screamed, "COVID co-ed mystery takes sinister turn," and "Glasses clue shocks Montana town." Website traffic soared with clickbait articles that recycled basic facts without advancing understanding of the case. Claire, invited to appear on morning talk shows and true crime podcasts, initially welcomed the attention as an opportunity to advocate for Emily. However, she quickly grew frustrated with interviewers who seemed more interested in dramatic reveals than substantive discussion of investigative failures. During one live television segment, she walked off set mid-interview saying, "My daughter isn't a headline for your entertainment. She's a heartbeat that stopped, and we need to find out why." Truth often arrives wearing the mask of coincidence, disguised as accidents that reveal patterns hiding in plain sight. Within days of the glasses discovery, Blake's modest ranch house transformed into an impromptu media siege. News vans lined the quiet residential street while reporters knocked on neighbors' doors seeking quotes and background information. Blake posted a handwritten note on his front porch reading, "I will not be tried on your lawns or in your comment sections," but the message only intensified speculation about his guilt or innocence. Meanwhile, police executed a limited search warrant that allowed them to examine common areas of Blake's property while respecting Fourth Amendment protections. Investigators carted away boxes labeled miscellaneous electronics, financial records, and personal correspondence, creating a visible parade of potential evidence that neighbors watched through curtained windows. The community's trust in due process sagged under the weight of visible investigative action that felt 2 years overdue. Claire hired a private investigator, Marisol Vega, a former federal analyst who had transitioned into freelance work after budget cuts eliminated her position with the Drug Enforcement Administration. Vega brought sophisticated techniques and federal databases that local police couldn't access, plus the luxury of focusing exclusively on Emily's case rather than juggling multiple investigations simultaneously. Vega's first priority involved interviewing contractors who had worked on Blake's property during his 4-year residence. She discovered that Blake had insisted the garage remain locked during lunch breaks and coffee rounds, claiming valuable tools were stored inside. However, other workers recalled the garage containing only basic lawn equipment and seasonal decorations, hardly the expensive items that would justify unusual security measures. One contractor remembered seeing a small jewelry box or trinket case on Blake's workbench during a bathroom renovation in spring 2022, approximately 1 year after Emily's disappearance. The worker described ornate purple velvet lining, but claimed the box vanished before demolition work began on the garage project. The timeline suggested Blake might have moved evidence when he learned about the construction plans. Patterns emerged from Vega's investigation. Blake was meticulously careful about storage and privacy, yet surprisingly laissez-faire about basic home maintenance and repairs. Neighbors described him as someone who would obsessively lock gates and secure windows, but wouldn't mow his lawn for weeks or repair broken fence panels. The contradiction between security consciousness and general negligence sharpened Vega's investigative focus. Digital forensics experts tracing Blake's online footprint uncovered participation in forums discussing pandemic isolation, property boundaries, and neighbors who don't respect quarantine protocols. In one deleted post from May 2021, just weeks after Emily's disappearance, Blake complained about college kids who blast music and throw parties when they should be quarantined and thinking about community responsibility. While circumstantial, Blake's language resonated with Rachel, who recalled Emily mentioning a nosy neighbor who watches the street too closely during their last video chat. Emily had laughed about someone who seemed to monitor comings and goings in the neighborhood, though she hadn't named Blake specifically or expressed serious concern about his behavior. DNA analysis of the glasses, nose pads and temple arms returned frustratingly inconclusive results, degraded by 2 years of heat, humidity and environmental exposure in the garage storage area. However, fiber analysis of the velvet case lining revealed traces of a distinctive plaid pattern that forensic specialists traced to blankets sold exclusively at a regional sporting goods chain during a limited-time promotion in early 2021. Store records showed Blake had purchased 2 plaid blankets on March 15, 2021, exactly 1 month before Emily's disappearance. When investigators asked Blake to produce the blankets for comparison testing, he claimed one had been donated to charity and the other lost during a camping trip. Explanations that couldn't be independently verified but seemed conveniently impossible to disprove. The circumstantial evidence was building, but prosecutors remained hesitant to file charges based on suspicious coincidences rather than direct proof of criminal behavior. District Attorney Jennifer Walsh, facing re-election in 18 months, worried about the political consequences of a high-profile case that might collapse in court due to insufficient evidence. Investigators finally requested a comprehensive property excavation warrant that would allow ground-penetrating radar examination of Blake's entire lot. However, administrative red tape and legal challenges from Blake's newly hired defense attorney stretched the approval process into weeks of bureaucratic delay that frustrated the Johnson family and their growing community of supporters. Se este caso já te prendeu, deixa o like. Isso ajuda a história de Emily Johnson a alcançar mais gente. Some shadows lean so long they redraw the map of trust, forcing entire communities to question what they thought they knew about the people living next door. By late August, 2 months after the glasses discovery, the Johnsons stood behind yellow police tape, watching cadaver dogs systematically sniff Blake's backyard in methodical grid patterns. The German shepherds, trained to detect human decomposition, showed interest in several areas, but no definitive alerts that would indicate remains buried on the property. Ground-penetrating radar revealed disturbed soil beneath the garage's original foundation, suggesting excavation that post-dated the home's 1987 construction. Forensic archaeologists carefully excavated the anomalous area, uncovering a cracked plastic storage bin that had been buried approximately 2 feet underground and covered with loose gravel and topsoil. Inside the container, wrapped in garbage bags that had protected contents from moisture damage, investigators found a collection that told a disturbing story. Pandemic-era grocery receipts dating from April 2021, a torn KN95 mask, various household items, and a single Polaroid photograph of Emily standing on her front porch, waving at the camera with a bright smile. The photograph was time-stamped April 15, 2021, exactly 2 days before Emily's reported disappearance, with metadata indicating it was taken at 6:42 p.m. from an elevated position consistent with a second-story window. Emily appeared unaware she was being photographed, captured in a candid moment of returning home from an evening walk despite her COVID-19 diagnosis. Blake claimed he found the photograph in his mailbox several months after Emily's disappearance and forgot to turn it over to police, an explanation that strained credibility given his apparent obsession with maintaining the buried storage container. The photograph's edges showed fingerprints in blue household paint that matched samples from Blake's basement workshop, suggesting he had handled it while working on home projects. Vega noted that the photographic angle aligned perfectly with Blake's upstairs bedroom window, which offered an unobstructed view of Emily's front porch and driveway. Measurements confirmed that the shot could only have been taken from that specific location, contradicting Blake's claim about finding it in his mailbox. The evidence suggested systematic surveillance rather than casual neighborly observation. Public outrage swelled like a summer thunderstorm building over mountain peaks. A candlelight march wound through downtown Missoula, growing from dozens to hundreds of participants as word spread through social media networks. Sam carried Emily's framed senior portrait at the front of the procession, tears streaming down his cheeks as supporters chanted his sister's name and demanded justice for failures that had allowed evidence to hide in plain sight for 2 years. Reporters' flashbulbs lit the night like distant lightning, capturing images that would define public memory of the case. Grieving parents walking arm in arm, community members holding signs reading, "Emily deserved better," and Sam's haunting artwork projected onto the courthouse walls by supporters who had organized the tribute without official permission. Within the police department, whispers of mismanagement grew louder, as rank-and-file officers privately criticized supervisors for the investigation's initial shortcomings. An anonymous officer leaked internal emails to local journalists, revealing that early tips about Blake's unusual behavior had been deprioritized due to low threat assessment and resource allocation focused on domestic violence cases that had spiked during lockdown isolation. The leaked communications showed that Detective Martinez had initially recommended Blake for formal interview and property search, but was overruled by supervisors who considered him a low-probability suspect based on his clean criminal record and cooperative attitude during initial questioning. The decision to defer Blake's investigation until higher priority leads were exhausted effectively buried the inquiry beneath an avalanche of other cases. Seeking definitive proof, Vega acquired cellular phone location data through a court order issued under the fictitious critical location statute, which allowed retrospective analysis of location services data in missing person investigations. The mobile phone logs placed Blake's device within 30 meters of a secluded riverside trail at 3:11 a.m. on April 17, 2021, the precise time frame investigators believed Emily left her house for the final time. When confronted with the location data, Blake offered a bizarre explanation about sleepwalking drives, undertaken to calm pandemic-induced anxiety and insomnia. He claimed to drive aimlessly through Missoula during early morning hours when stress prevented sleep, a statement that was both difficult to verify and deeply incriminating given the timing and location involved. Blake's defense attorney argued that insomnia-driven nighttime drives were common coping mechanisms during pandemic isolation, pointing to increased sales of sleep aids and anxiety medications during 2020 and 2021. However, the specific location and timing created a pattern of behavior that corroborated other evidence pointing toward Blake's involvement in Emily's disappearance. The photograph, burial container, location data, and suspicious explanations were building a circumstantial case that prosecutors finally felt confident presenting to a grand jury. District Attorney Walsh, under tremendous public pressure and facing overwhelming evidence, decided to move forward with formal charges despite the absence of Emily's remains or direct witnesses to criminal behavior. Even stone walls remember the heat of the hands that built them, and Blake's property was finally revealing the secrets it had concealed beneath layers of normalcy and calculated deception. A breakthrough arrived from an unexpected quarter when Janet Morrison, a former roommate of Blake's from his previous residence in Billings, contacted Vega after recognizing him on national news coverage. Morrison had shared a duplex with Blake for 8 months in 2018 and remembered his escalating paranoia about neighbors, noise levels, and what he perceived as disrespectful behavior from younger tenants in their apartment complex. Morrison recounted Blake's increasingly hostile reactions during their cohabitation, how he fumed about students who played music too loudly, threatened to teach responsibility to people who didn't follow community guidelines, and obsessively documented perceived violations of lease agreements and community standards. She described finding notebooks filled with Blake's meticulous records of neighbors' activities, complete with timestamps and detailed behavioral observations. Her sworn affidavit provided crucial behavioral context that transformed isolated incidents into a recognizable pattern of escalating control and surveillance. Morrison also recalled Blake's obsession with community standards and his belief that younger people, especially college students, showed fundamental disrespect for social responsibilities that required correction through direct intervention. Simultaneously, forensic linguists from the Montana State University Criminology Department compared Blake's deleted forum posts with a series of anonymous letters Claire had received throughout 2022. The letters, initially dismissed as cruel pranks from internet trolls, contained detailed knowledge of Emily's disappearance and taunting suggestions that she had left voluntarily to spare her family additional pain. Advanced computational linguistics analysis revealed a 94% probability match between Blake's writing patterns and the anonymous correspondence. Distinctive grammatical constructions, vocabulary choices, and punctuation habits created a linguistic fingerprint that connected Blake directly to psychological harassment of Emily's family during their most vulnerable period of grieving. The letters, once considered peripheral harassment, now represented crucial evidence of consciousness of guilt and ongoing criminal behavior. Blake had not only concealed evidence of Emily's disappearance, but actively tormented her family with false hope and misdirection, demonstrating a level of calculated cruelty that prosecutors could present as evidence of premeditation and malicious intent. Prosecutors moved to convene a grand jury under Montana's Cold Case Activation Clause, a legislative provision that streamlined judicial review for cases involving missing persons and potential homicide. The statute recognized that traditional evidence standards might be insufficient for cases where perpetrators had years to conceal or destroy physical proof of their crimes. Inside the Missoula County Courthouse, Claire clasped Rachel's hand as prosecutors presented their case to 23 randomly selected citizens who would determine whether probable cause existed for formal criminal charges. The grand jury process occurred behind closed doors, but supporters filled the courthouse hallways, creating a visible demonstration of community support for accountability and justice. Marcus Vega's presentation lasted 4 hours, methodically walking jurors through a timeline that connected Blake's suspicious behavior, physical evidence, location data, and psychological harassment into a coherent narrative of deliberate criminal conduct. Each slide built upon previous evidence, creating a mosaic of circumstantial proof that pointed overwhelmingly toward Blake's guilt, despite the absence of direct witnesses or confession. Blake's public defender argued that coincidence and pandemic-era anxiety could explain suspicious behavior, emphasizing the dangerous precedent of convicting citizens based on circumstantial evidence and behavioral analysis rather than concrete proof of criminal acts. The defense strategy focused on reasonable doubt and the fundamental principle that suspicion, however compelling, must not substitute for definitive evidence of guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Still, the absence of Emily's body weighed heavily on some jurors who struggled with the concept of homicide charges without physical proof of death. Legal precedent supported no-body prosecutions, but the emotional reality of voting to indict someone for murder when the victim's fate remained technically unknown created psychological barriers for conscientious citizens trying to serve justice while respecting due process protections. Vega countered with national statistics demonstrating successful no-body convictions in cases with substantially less circumstantial evidence than Blake's case presented. She framed the issue as a matter of moral courage, arguing that allowing perfect criminals to escape accountability by successfully concealing remains would incentivize more sophisticated violence against vulnerable community members. After 8 hours of deliberation, the panel voted 19-4 to charge Blake with second-degree homicide and unlawful confinement. The Johnsons, waiting in a conference room down the hall, exhaled a breath they had been holding for 847 days when prosecutors delivered the indictment decision. Rachel sobbed with relief. Sam smiled for the first time since Emily's disappearance. Claire whispered a prayer of gratitude mixed with grief for the daughter who would never see justice delivered in person. A voice once ignored can become the gavel that reshapes silence, forcing entire systems to confront failures that enabled tragedy through institutional apathy and investigative incompetence. Facing trial with overwhelming circumstantial evidence, Blake's defense team negotiated a plea bargain that would require full disclosure of all material facts relating to Emily's disappearance and death. The agreement spared Blake a potential life sentence while guaranteeing the Johnson family answers they had sought for over 3 years of uncertainty and investigative frustration. Under oath in a packed courtroom, Blake described confronting Emily about quarantine violations on the evening of April 16, 2021. According to his statement, Emily had been taking evening walks despite her positive COVID-19 test, behavior Blake considered irresponsible endangerment of community health. He claimed to have approached her driveway to educate her about pandemic protocols and social responsibility. Blake's account portrayed the confrontation as initially civil discussion that escalated when Emily laughed dismissively at his concerns about community safety. He described feeling disrespected and ignored by her casual attitude toward what he considered serious public health violations that endangered vulnerable neighbors, especially elderly residents who could die from COVID-19 exposure. The plea statement described a momentary rage triggered by Emily's laughter and her suggestion that Blake should mind his own business instead of spying on neighbors. Blake admitted to striking Emily in anger, claiming he intended only to get her attention, but acknowledging that she fell backward and struck her head on the concrete driveway with a sickening sound that immediately filled him with panic and regret. Terrified by Emily's unconsciousness and the potential consequences of his actions, Blake claimed he carried her to his pickup truck with the intention of driving her to the hospital for medical treatment. However, his panic and fear of criminal prosecution led him to drive instead to an abandoned storage facility near the Clark Fork River, where he intended to give her time to recover while he decided how to handle the situation. Blake's statement omitted crucial details about the hours between Emily's injury and his discovery that she was unresponsive. Under pressure from prosecutors, he eventually admitted that he had waited until morning before checking on her condition, by which time Emily showed no signs of life. Medical experts testified that prompt medical intervention might have saved Emily's life, making Blake's delay a crucial factor in her death. The plea statement remained deliberately vague about disposal methods, but under sustained questioning, Blake sketched a rough map indicating Emily's remains were located in a cedar grove approximately 9 miles south of Missoula, near a hiking trail he had used for weekend camping trips. The location was remote enough to avoid accidental discovery, but accessible enough for a single person to transport remains without heavy equipment. Search teams mobilized immediately, using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs to examine the area Blake had indicated. After 2 days of systematic searching, investigators located partial skeletal remains buried beneath fallen logs and seasonal debris in a natural depression that would have been invisible to casual hikers passing on nearby trails. Because 2 years of Montana weather had intervened, harsh winters, spring flooding, and summer heat, forensic experts could only catalogue partial skeletal fragments and personal effects that had survived environmental exposure. Among the recovered items were Emily's distinctive silver bracelet engraved with "Stay Brave," a gift from her grandmother, and fragments of the second plaid blanket Blake had purchased but claimed to have lost during camping trips. The coroner ruled Emily's death homicide by blunt force trauma, confirming that skull fractures were consistent with Blake's account of her falling and striking concrete. However, the medical examiner abstained from providing graphic details about decomposition or injury patterns, respecting the family's request for dignity in reporting Emily's final condition. News of the discovery broke across national media networks within hours, transforming Missoula from a quiet college town into the center of a true crime sensation that drew reporters, podcasters, and online amateur detectives seeking details about the case that had finally reached resolution after years of uncertainty and investigative failure. Some residents organized spontaneous memorial gatherings along the Clark Fork River, floating luminaries and flower bouquets downstream, while sharing memories of Emily and reflecting on the tragedy that had haunted their community for over 3 years. Others expressed anger toward police leadership, demanding resignations and systemic reforms to prevent similar investigative failures in future missing person cases. The police department announced an internal audit examining decision-making processes during Emily's initial investigation, pledging to retrain officers in cold case management and implement new protocols for missing person investigations during public health emergencies. However, for the Johnson family, these institutional gestures felt like inadequate responses to failures that had cost precious time when Emily might still have been saved. Emily's memorial service filled the University of Montana's largest auditorium, with overflow crowds watching live streams in adjacent buildings. Professors spoke of her intellectual curiosity and passion for cultural anthropology. Friends read excerpts from her unfinished thesis, examining how communities preserve memory across generations through storytelling and ritual practices. Research that had gained tragic relevance through her own disappearance and discovery. Claire placed Emily's repaired glasses on the memorial lectern, the lenses now clear of dust and fingerprints, reflecting light from hundreds of candles held by mourners who filled every seat and lined the walls of the auditorium. The glasses had become symbols of both concealment and revelation, representing evidence hidden and truth finally exposed through persistence and community pressure for accountability. Robert, his voice quaking with emotion barely held in check, addressed the gathering. Emily taught us to see the world differently through her studies of how cultures remember their missing members. May we never forget what we finally learned to look at when we stopped accepting easy answers and demanded the truth she deserved. Justice may arrive with a limp and years of delay, but its footsteps still reach the door when communities refuse to let institutional failures become permanent silence. The sentencing hearing in December 2023 drew national media attention, with reporters from major networks setting up satellite trucks outside the Missoula County Courthouse, while true crime podcasters live-streamed commentary for audiences following the case's conclusion. Judge Maria Ramirez, known for thoughtful decisions in complex criminal cases, had reviewed thousands of pages of evidence, victim impact statements, and legal precedents before determining Blake's fate. Invoking Montana's Community Restitution Directive, a sentencing enhancement for crimes that exploit community trust and social vulnerability, Judge Ramirez sentenced Blake to 35 years in state prison without possibility of parole. The judge specifically cited an offense that thrived on communal apathy and institutional failure, acknowledging systemic problems that had enabled Blake's crime and subsequent concealment of evidence. Outside the courthouse steps, reporters surrounded Claire Johnson, asking whether the sentence felt adequate for a crime that had stolen her daughter's future and tormented her family for years of uncertainty. Claire's response, delivered with dignity that reflected years of advocating for Emily while maintaining faith in eventual justice, became a defining moment in the case's public memory. "Nothing can restore a stolen sunrise or bring back the conversations we'll never have," she said, looking directly into television cameras that broadcast her words across the country. "But at least the night of not knowing has ended. Emily can finally rest, and other families might be spared similar anguish if we learn from the failures that enabled this tragedy." In the months following Blake's sentencing, Montana lawmakers introduced the Emily Johnson Transparency Bill, comprehensive legislation mandating quicker escalation protocols for missing person cases during public health emergencies and requiring law enforcement agencies to maintain detailed documentation of investigative decisions that could be reviewed by oversight committees and victim advocacy groups. The bill also established funding streams for advanced forensic testing in cold cases, created victim-family liaison positions within major police departments, and required annual training updates for officers handling missing person investigations. Critics argued the legislation was symbolic rather than substantive, but advocacy groups saw it as meaningful progress toward preventing similar investigative failures in future cases. Police departments statewide began digitizing evidence archives, implementing new case management software that allowed families monitored access to investigation progress while protecting sensitive details that could compromise ongoing work. The balance between transparency and operational security required careful calibration, but the reforms represented significant improvement over previous systems that kept families completely isolated from investigative processes. Rachel Nguyen, now graduated with a criminal justice degree focused on victim advocacy, launched The Unfinished Voice, a non-profit organization pairing technology volunteers with cold case families to provide research support, emotional resources, and advocacy training. The organization's first office opened in Missoula with funding from crowdsourcing campaigns and grants from national victim rights foundations. Sam Johnson, having channeled his grief into increasingly sophisticated artistic expression, designed the nonprofit's logo, a pair of eyeglasses framing an open horizon where mountains met sky. His art had evolved from desperate protest into purposeful memorial, creating beauty from tragedy while keeping Emily's memory alive through visual storytelling that reached audiences words couldn't touch. The first academic scholarship established in Emily's name funded graduate research on community responses to crisis isolation, supporting students investigating how social disasters create vulnerabilities that enable violence against marginalized populations. Emily's academic passion for cultural memory studies had gained tragic relevance, but her intellectual legacy would now inspire research that might prevent similar tragedies. The scholarship recipient studied Emily's case as an example of how institutional failures compound individual crimes, examining decision-making processes that prioritized efficiency over thoroughness and resource allocation that reflected systemic biases about which victims deserved comprehensive investigation. Their research contributed to national discussions about police reform and victim advocacy. On the second anniversary of Emily's funeral, the Johnson family gathered at the Riverside Memorial Garden, where her ashes had been scattered among wildflowers that bloomed each spring in colors that reminded Claire of her daughter's bright clothing and optimistic personality. Hundreds of luminaries floated down the Clark Fork River like fallen stars seeking the ocean. Robert whispered to his wife as they watched the lights drift downstream. "Feel that. The current still carries her story to places we'll never see." Claire closed her eyes, imagining the water memorizing every ripple Emily had created through her brief but meaningful life, carrying that memory toward distant communities that might learn from Missoula's tragedy and triumph. In that moment of quiet reflection, surrounded by friends who had sustained them through the darkest years of their lives, grief and purpose braided together into something that resembled peace. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of meaning that would outlast sorrow and transform suffering into service for other families facing similar darkness. The wind through the cottonwoods sounded almost like whispered conversations, and Claire allowed herself to imagine Emily's voice among the rustling leaves, still teaching her family to see the world with clearer vision and deeper compassion for the fragile connections that bind communities together in times of loss and hope. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases across America. Thank you for following Emily Johnson's story. See you in the next video.